Washington's clear thinking headquarters. The Morning Majority, 5 to 9 on 630 WMAL.
Coming up tonight, Diane Sawyer, anchor of ABC World News, is hosting a 2-hour television special, Jacqueline Kennedy in Her Own Words. Now, these are conversations that she actually recorded over the years while in the White House. Is that right, Diane?
She recorded them right after his assassination, 4 months after her husband's death. And all that emotion is still very fresh inside her. But 8.5 hours. And finally, we learned she's nothing that we thought she was as we watched her with that smile and those sunglasses. She is such a brilliant, intuitive observer of what's happening and very funny.
Why did she record these conversations?
She felt that her husband was robbed of the chance to tell his story of his administration and to do what all presidents get to do, which is to reflect on their time, so that she wanted to do it for him. And she was a passionate believer in history.
Now, there have been some reports about some of the things that she said in advance of this program, and most specifically about Martin Luther King, that have sort of raised a few eyebrows that were quite surprising. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's an interesting Rorschach test about history, because she said those things, but what you don't know, unless you look back and listen to the whole tape, is J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI and hated Martin Luther King, has told her that Martin Luther King derided the funeral and made fun of the people at the funeral, undoubtedly making mischief, because he hated King so much. So she is reacting in a spasm of anguish to the fact that he had done this, about the moment that she had planned to pay tribute to her assassinated husband. So when you hear that, you understand that this is a wife, a grieving wife.
What did she think about Lyndon Baines Johnson? Much has been written about whether or not she had a good relationship or a bad relationship with him. What was her opinion of him?
Well, she actually had a personally good relationship, and of course he was always calling her, and she felt he was very generous to her and to her little children. But she worried about several things. She was very worried about Vietnam already and what she felt that he was doing. And she was also, of course, anticipating, I think, that her brother-in-law Bobby would run against him. But at the same time, she felt that he was getting credit for things her husband had initiated, civil rights legislation, and that he was not the president that her husband was, and that he was this big, untamed force. And so she says some pretty wicked things about him as vice president and then president, but it is in that context.
Sounds like that she will be funny and entertaining, but also extremely frank and sometimes impolitic about LBJ and others. Yeah. I'm a little surprised it was for public consumption. And how did it come to light through the Kennedy family? How did these come to be published?
That's such a good question, because I read them and I listened to them, and it's like sitting on a sofa with her late at night in the living room, and she is just talking about everybody. And I said to Caroline, did you think about editing these? Didn't you wince? And she said she would have winced.
Right.
But they were her recordings for history, and once I start to edit them, they become mine. And I didn't feel that was my role. So I trust everybody to go back and put them in context.
What was the reason that they came out now as opposed to later?
Caroline decided that the 50th anniversary of her father's inauguration would have been a time her mother felt was historic and right. And I also think, since her mother had said only that they should be released long after her death, that Caroline felt there were still so many of us who were there and who remember, and that she wanted to release them before this generation moves on. So I think there were multiple considerations, and all I can say is I promise you will not be bored.
It is fascinating, Diane, but I have to ask you about the question about how these tapes came to be made available. I mean, there have been some reports, and I want you to either confirm or deny this, that you got access to these tapes after ABC made a decision to sort of put the kibosh on a miniseries about the Kennedy family.
No, again, entertainment divisions operate separately from news divisions, as you well know. Their decisions had nothing to me. I was always operating on a completely separate track, and this is about me and the ABC News request to Caroline Kennedy. It had nothing to do with that.
Did she get into at all the death of John F. Kennedy and why or who she thought was responsible for his death?
No, she doesn't talk about the responsibility, and I know there have been some early reports that she blames people for it. She doesn't. You hear her emotion about it. You hear her emotion about the things that he was saying before he died. He said at one point, because he was thinking of Abraham Lincoln, that Lincoln, in fact, died at a moment history saw him at a kind of pinnacle of unifying the country. And he said, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, if someone shot me now, this would be a moment for me too. And she says, my goodness, I look back and see that now. And each of these things is haunting. So she takes us right up to that moment. She talks about Dallas. She talks about the Connollys.
At the end of the day, Diane, we've talked about a lot of topics. Are there things that we're going to be really, really surprised about when we hear the whole thing?
I think you're going to be surprised at who she reveals she was, how scared she was to come in the White House, how little confidence she had, how sure she was going to do something to embarrass him or embarrass the country, because she was not your conventional politician's wife. She hated campaigning. She had bouffant hair. She had those clothes we'd never seen before from Europe. And her struggle to become the Jacqueline Kennedy we all know is a real revelation.
Well, it sounds fascinating. 2-hour special tonight on ABC, 9 o'clock. Jacqueline Kennedy in her own words. Diane Sawyer, thanks very much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you.